We are now recording. This is the esteemed Scott Aaronson with the humble Robin Hanson having a conversation.
All right, it's good to see you, Robin.
It's good to see you, Scott.
You've been probably involved in this conversation for longer than I have.
But you're certainly fully qualified by this point to talk. So if you'll indulge me slightly, I'd like to frame the question initially in terms of what did we think would happen without AI? That is, where did we think the future was going to go anyway, and how fast? So that seems to me to help in thinking about the many concerns people have about AI. So I might frame that as saying, in the last 10,000 or even 100,000 years, humans have changed a lot over time, due to cultural evolution. And we are, in some sense, quite different than we used to be in not just some, surface area, but in pretty deep cultural ways, and even in how we experience things. And plausibly, those rates of change accelerate as the economy and technology accelerates. And in the future, we should expect in the long run, like similar magnitudes, even larger of change, like over 1 million, billion, or trillion years. And we should expect our descendants, even if there's never any AI, or even if there's never brain emulations, they'll still not only have a lot of cultural change, they'll probably mess with themselves genetically or in some other ways, and they will just become different in pretty big ways. And if growth accelerates, if change accelerates, that could even happen in relatively short number of years. And some of us living today might overlap with that future period where they would just be really different. And when you describe this scenario to people, people don't seem that bothered by it. I mean, they can get somewhat bothered, but at that level, they say, yeah, kids will be kids, let them be. Let's see what they come up with, what the darn things kids do. And then when you talk about AI, it seems to me when I probe deeper and say, what's your real worry? The worry is, well, they're going to be a kind of descendant that will be more powerful than us, sort of naturally gravitate to positions of influence and accumulate wealth. And that's bad because they're different. And that seems to me like, you look, but our humans will be different. And then people give me various stories about how, well, humans could never get that different. They won't always at least be something like us. But AIs could get a lot more different. And that's the real problem.
Yeah. I think a huge amount of this, is tied to the rate of the change, right? It's like, let's we can imagine one scenario where, as you said, maybe we have children who are 1% different from us, in their deepest values and preferences and so forth. But, we have influenced them. They are like us, but they're also 1% different. And then their children are 1% different from them and so forth. And okay, if you iterate that over a few hundred generations, you will get people who are very, very unlike us. Right. And yet, most people, at some philosophical level, at least they seem okay with it. Maybe if you actually describe to them the specifics of our descendants and what they would be doing, maybe then the people would be very unhappy. Okay, but at least in the abstract, they're okay with that, right? But then you could imagine, let's say at the opposite extreme, just a takeover by some aliens. The movie Independence Day, right? They just they land, they start killing us all, or let's say the contact between modern Homo sapiens and one of the previous species that we either interbred with a little bit, but mostly just wiped out, right? And that seems much more concerning. I mean, first of all, because it's much more abrupt, and second of all, because there is just much less opportunity to influence the thing that is abruptly replacing us, right? And I think you can vary people's feelings about AI by sort of making it seem more like the first scenario or more like the second one, right?
Right, but it wasn't really plausible that it was going to stay 1% a generation into the indefinite future, right? That is, growth has been accelerating.
No. But I'm saying,
Right.
just as an extreme to anchor our intuitions, right? And then, and then we could make it 10% a generation, right? And then maybe, okay, people are, a little bit more concerned, but they're still basically okay with it.
Right. We have a pause in the connection here, but wait till it overcomes.
But I think, oh,
we're back. We had a brief pause.
All right, then.
Okay, so some people have told me they don't care so much about the rate of change, it's about where it eventually goes, but you're postulating more plausibly perhaps that it's really about the rate of change.
Well, I think the two are related. I think when the rate of change becomes too great, then people feel like they have left control over where it is going.
So in that case, the real concern is about rates of change, and maybe what we really want is an overall slowdown of rates of change, and isn't about AI in particular. It's about just overall rates of change.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I find it hard to even think about your hypothetical where technology advances, but never in the direction of AI, right? Maybe that's because I'm a computer scientist, and I feel like, like every machine kind of wants to be a Turing machine,
Okay.
It's either a universal Turing machine, or else, it has just been somehow temporarily prevented from becoming one, and
okay, so let me frame it a different way then. Let's think about partiality. That is, like we're each different in many ways from each other and from other possible things. And along some dimensions, we feel especially partial.
Yes.
We especially are reluctant, or so we feel competitive and rivalrous with other things that are differently along that dimension. That's not true for all dimensions. And in our society in the last a few decades or centuries, we've had some strong norms about suppressing certain kinds of partiality, right? Toward your gender or race, or income level or profession or things like that. Even though some of those kinds of partiality are quite plausibly things that genetic or cultural evolution would select for. They would select for, even say racist, and that's a perfectly plausible thing for genetic engineering to select for. And we're suppressing it. Even like more related to AI is like non-neurotypical variations. They really think differently in some sense, and people are often partial about that dimension. They're somewhat put off or horrified even a bit by people who just think substantially differently. And then if we think about AI, we could think about that's a dimension of potential partiality, and then we could ask, to what extent do we want to be partial along that dimension relative to the other ones? Because in some sense, if we allow ourselves to embrace the variation in that dimension, the AIs can be an ally for us regarding many other kinds of partiality, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, this line of thinking goes all the way back to Turing. I mean, in his paper on the imitation game, he was very explicit about this, right? And people have, of course, made the point many times that he was different from other people, and sexual orientation, and plausibly was driven to suicide because of that, and that may have influenced the way he thought about these things, right? But he was sort of making almost a moral plea in his 1950 paper, right? That if an entity is indistinguishable from something you've already regarded as conscious, then by what right do you regard it otherwise, right?
But that's attempting to eliminate the differences in some sense.
Now,
but what if we accept some differences? What if we say, okay, they are going to be different in some ways, but how much do those differences matter would be the question.
No, of course it's a huge question. Now I would say that the moral situation for AIs is obviously very, very different than that for humans, if only because you can copy them, you can back them up, you can rewind them to a previous state, right?
Well, that certainly makes them have different sort of moral conundrums and issues, but it might not affect so much whether they're valued at all or whether
Mm.
they're, them
Yeah.
replacing us, how much is that to be
That's right.
feared, right?
That's
So,
right. Now, I think another very relevant point here is that this is plausibly a larger leap than any that humans have been asked to make in the past. Regarding race and gender and sexual orientation and all of that. Right? I mean, there have not been sort of at least for the past 10,000 years for the history of civilization. There have not been sort of multiple intelligent, full language using species on Earth, right? There's been one. We have a common evolutionary history. We are all, interfertile with each other, right? We can, reduce hybrids of any of us
well,
from any backgrounds, right? So it was not such a or rather you could say if already then it was sort of such a leap for people to sort of recognize each other's common humanity, right? Imagine just how much larger a leap it is going to be for people to sort of recognize moral patienthood in on the part of these other entities. But I think that again a lot of it has to do with gradualness, right? So I mean imagine that we have cyborgs, right? And I was just thinking about this the other day, right? That I mean the first even if there is a super intelligent paperclip maximizing AI or there's something that suddenly appears on the earth, right? It is not going to appear on into a world quite like the current one. I don't think it is going to appear into a world in which AI is already much more integrated with how we live and work, and where you could imagine that there are already all sorts of human AI hybrid entities, right?
right.
That are sort of humans working together with AIs in extremely tight feedback loops, and
Right. So it seems a bit unfair
yeah.
to the AI in the sense that what we're doing is we're imagining the most extreme different AIs that could possibly exist in a somewhat distant future. And we're comparing that to us now, as opposed to imagining like what will AIs actually be like in the near term. Or what will humans be like in the far term?
Well,
that is, the early AIs would almost surely
right.
be much more like us.
Right.
I mean, like large language models are much more like us in terms of their opinions and their styles and all sorts of things. Only later that they would get very different.
Right. Well, I mean, let's put it this way. If you literally believe in the Yudkowsky and Foom scenario, right, then, you are worried about the first thing because, you literally think that's what's going to happen, right? That,
right. And I think,
yeah.
So when I talk to people, like if you press on the Foom scenario,
yeah,
a great many people cave, but they say, but fundamentally the problem is the AI is just going to be different, and that's the real problem. And eventually AI will be in control and different, and that's just the thing I'm worried about. And they're actually, I mean, the Foom is just a thing that exaggerates and accentuates the concern by taking something that would otherwise be farther in the future and pulling it to sooner.
I see. Now the Yudkowskians are very, very explicit. Let's be clear here, right? That what they're worried about is not humans being taken over by something different, but rather they're being taken over by something uninteresting, something sort of trivial,
Sure.
Just making a bunch of molecular squiggles, right? Something that we would not value at all, right? And to be honest, and they give arguments for this involving the orthogonality thesis and instrumental convergence and so forth. I still have difficulty, and maybe this is just my own inadequacy, but I have difficulty imagining something that is both one, sort of smart enough to form and execute a plan for taking over the world and displacing us, and dealing with all of the obstacles that will arise along the way, but then number two is sort of uninteresting.
Right.
I mean, like I
hard
I
to imagine.
admit that
Well,
it's
so, but
possible in principle. I mean, certainly humans have devoted, very great intelligence to, goals that I would regard as stupid or as completely misguided. But there is still a sort of imaginative gap there.
it's a similar issue for the eventual humans in the
Mm.
counterfactual without AI. That is, many people I've talked to basically say, okay, if it's basically a random walk in large scale space of values and styles, and you go far enough random walking in that space, then yeah, you'll get places I don't value. They tend to assume that they value only a small fraction of that space, and therefore the large scale drift. And I think that's basically the Froome argument as well. The argument is just whatever in effect values it starts with before Froome, through this process of growth, it's hard to preserve the in effect values through that growth process, and therefore there'd be random walk in some space of its preferences and styles, and wherever you go in that space typically is bad, is the claim. The typical places that a random walk goes in that space.
Right.
So that's true for humans and AI. It's really the same argument.
Yeah, right. I don't know what's the relevant distribution here when they talk about like a random point in the space of values. Like, I don't know what is the measure over possible values, right? I think, I guess, what matters in practice is the distribution of values of the AIs that we are likely to create, right? And I would like to.
Well, there's the distribution values
Yeah.
initially when we create them, and then what happens after they evolve over a substantial growth trajectory into something else.
Yes. Now, this question of value drift is interesting. I mean, maybe we could drill down on it.
Sure.
You seem very interested in talking about it. No, so I don't know if you read Plato in the Googleplex by the novelist Rebecca Goldstein, right? But
No.
she's trying to imagine Plato just inexplicably brought back into the modern world, and having conversations about in the Google cafeteria with and about is can you sort of define morality by something like the PageRank algorithm, right? But her and things like that. But her Plato is sort of just instantly brought up to speed with women are intellectual equals,
Right.
racism is bad, and all those things, right? In order that you can sort of have the more more interesting conversations, or interesting to us anyway, right? And on the one hand, that seemed utterly implausible in a way, right?
Right.
Right. With this, from this completely different context. But on the other hand, they're I mean, part of the reason why people, still read the Socratic dialogues today is that there is a kind of universality to them, right? They do talk about issues that we still think of as relevant 2,500 years later. And I think, again, it might just be a question of time. I mean, it might be that if you brought Plato into the present in the time machine, for the first week or two, he is he's just, utterly in shock and disoriented and so forth. But then if you let him spend a decade in this world, then he becomes more like the character that Rebecca Goldstein is imagining, right? Who can just engage in Plato style philosophy about contemporary issues, right? It would come to seem ordinary to him given enough time.
So what I think many people I've talked to think is that this was a conditional convergence. That is, because Plato was human and we're human, that's why he might converge to our opinions with 10 years of experience, but minds from a larger space would not. And, we could maybe factor the whole space here into two subspaces, a product of them. One is the subspace where things do converge from a wide range of points, and the other is the subspace where they don't. There's just random drift. And then we ask that second part of the subspace, how important is it?
Right.
To us. And then also just how plausible is it that AI would go away that when humans wouldn't? Because it could be a path dependence thing, right? Had our ancestors started out differently, then the whole trajectory would be different. But by the time we're here on the path, then there'll be more of a convergence on the path. But AI will kind of be on the path here with us initially.
Yes, and yeah, and I mean, certainly what we're seeing so far are, AIs whose sort of intelligence comes from being trained on our entire collective output, and that is why they are able to converse with us so fluently, right? And that is why, for some definition of understand, they, are able to understand our values and so
Right.
forth. And now, the Yudkowskian position would be that, all of that is deceptive, right? All of that is just an artifact of, the present stage, and after a certain
Right.
point, it fumes and it becomes something that is utterly alien to us. And basically, I am, in this sort of position where when I'm talking to, let's say, my academic colleagues who completely reject the Yudkowskian position as a science fiction fantasy, then I am trying to convince them that no, that is possible. There is no deep principle that rules that out. And when I am talking to, like, the rationalist community, to the AI doomers, then I am trying to convince them that no, this scenario is not the only one. It is not inevitable, right? I can easily imagine other one. I don't know of any deep principle that says
in some,
yeah.
The position required to make sense of this sort of stance requires an asymmetry, I think. So you not only need to say that AI would evolve, out of the bounds of reasonableness into this wider space of possibilities, but that without AI, our descendants would not. That there's some sort of human core which would keep us within bounds, regardless of what tech our descendants use and what cultures they go into.
Right. So that's interesting. It's hard to imagine a world, where technology just develops, by its own economic logic, and where people don't eventually want to make things into universal computers. And once they have universal computers, imbuing them with more and more intelligence, having them do things that they themselves understand less and less, right? And so you could say some people have complained, right, that so much of the innovation today is in the realm of bits rather than the realm of atoms, right? But it seems to me like there is something intrinsic to technology that just sort of pushes you in that direction. Okay, but you could say, suppose that we had a Butlerian jihad. Is that what it's called? Suppose that
from the Dune novel.
By government fiat, right? By we just forcibly prevented anyone from building systems that were too intelligent. Maybe we restricted the amount of compute that was available to everyone, right? Then how would technology develop under that scenario, right? And it's hard to disentangle the effects of just the totalitarian regime that you would need to enforce those restrictions at all, right? But I mean, could you imagine technology then developing, let's say, more in a 1950s science fiction direction? Of course, in 1950 science fiction they did have robots, right? But the robots kind of somehow weren't usually the main point, right? The main point was the spaceships and the flying cars,
right?
And all
we've revised that. But you could take the intermediate age of M position and say, well, imagine a future where minds are digital, but they all descend from human minds,
right?
And then the human mind, even if there's AIs, they're just not as good as the human minds, and human minds dominate competitively, not artificially, but then they would still plausibly evolve to become strange. And there's not an obvious limit to how strange they could get.
Yes. I mean, so in terms of how strange things could get, right? I mean, do you imagine that, there will still be agents with different interests? There will still be morality.
Yeah.
To me, like certain things, like let's say the golden rule in morality, and all
Right.
that follows from it, right? They seem, almost as hard to vary as it would be hard to vary arithmetic, right?
Right. So as a social
Yeah.
scientist, I would say, and as a human scientist, I say many
Yes.
features of society and our minds and ourselves aren't accidents. They exist for functional reasons.
Yes.
And those are reasons to expect versions of them to exist in the future. That
Yes.
is, we expect laughter and anger and love and fury and law and markets and governance and language. I mean, these aren't things we think will just go away, as a happenstance of us. So when people say they're worried about, the future not laughing or something, I go, but there's a reason for laughter. It's not an accident.
Yeah.
Now the question is how context. No, but future laughter may be somewhat different than ours. Future love may be somewhat different than ours. And then some people say, no, they really want the human versions, the versions we have now. It's not enough if the future just loves and laughs. They need to love and laugh our way.
Yeah, no, there have been sort of generations of science fiction, trying to, trying as hard as it could to sort of envision the possibilities here. And of course, in lots of science fiction, partly just driven by the demands of, you need to have a story, right?
Characters, you need characters.
Of course, there are these far future beings who might be radically different from us in many ways, but they are still driven by the same kind of drives that we are, and and have the same kinds of conflicts, or find value in love and family and the same kind of things that we do, because without that, how do you even have a story, right? Or at least a story that we could read and have anything to identify with in it, right? But what one very interesting thing that I've noticed is that there is almost no good science fiction about a singularity, right? Or about the explosion to super intelligence, because once you get to the point where sort of anything could happen, where you have beings that are so much more intelligent than us, that we can't understand them anymore, right? Or maybe they can create a simulation of us, or they can create a simulation that itself has another simulation in it, right? It's like it's hard to tell, where is the story, right? And I think that maybe the point that people are worried about are sort of the point at which any science fiction story inevitably becomes bad, because there is no story left to tell anymore that is comprehensible.
Someone could argue that that's therefore a bias that makes us less likely to envision and therefore fear a future where things get really strange. And but my argument would be more, if things were going to get strange with AI, we're going to get strange without AI. And it's the strangeness you're really bothered by. And that makes the more fundamental question, do we want to allow change to continue? So, I mean, I probably share your opinion on this, but I feel like we should just honestly engage the question. Like there's a book that I read a while ago called Against Civilization, which a whole bunch of essays saying civilization was a mistake. Like we went too far. We were happy in the forager world and subsistence farming, and civilization when makes us more alienated, and we're in this strange world, and it was a mistake. Now that's a coherent position and it's worth engaging. In the end, I would reject that, but there's a sense in which many people, if they really saw the future and where we're really going, they wouldn't like that. And that's probably always been true. If people in the past had really understood where the future was going, and they were allowed to vote on it, they might have voted no.
Yes. Now, I think there is a serious argument to be made that, for, I mean, that there are hardly any pure forager civilizations left on Earth, right?
Right.
But the ones that there are should be preserved, should be allowed to continue. People should be, even allowed to, go into the forests and form, new such civilizations if they want, right? But then, I mean, you do get, as we see with, let's say, okay, the Amish, obviously you're not foragers.
Right.
They decided
Sure.
to freeze things, in the at roughly 1700s level of technology. But if they have a medical emergency, then they will go and they will get modern medical care, right?
Right.
And so you could there are, like, especially around medicine, someone in your
Right.
forager
Well,
society is
I mean,
dying from some from something that could easily be fixed in the city over the hill, right? What do you
right.
do about that, right? It's hard for the world to even coexist. Of course, the actual forager societies were threatened by much more prosaic things, just the industrial civilization, taking all of their land and chasing them away, but in many cases, killing them, right? I think there is an argument that sort of as you sort of keep revising the draft of what it means to have a civilization or whatever, you want to save backup copies as you go. Right, you want to say, like, yes, we could return to this
Well,
previous level of technology if we had to. We
but well,
have people who still remember how to do it.
right. It might not just be
Mm.
knowing how to do the old one. It might be that the new one has a competitive advantage over the old one, and
Yes,
you'd have to do some sort of collective action to resist that competitive advantage.
that's right. I mean, and I think that typically is what we see in practice, right? I mean, the sometimes we have to either set aside land for or we have to we have to in one way or the other subsidize. Sometimes it's subsidized by just people with retro interests. I don't know, the
Well,
Williamsburg, Virginia, or whatever,
well,
right?
but more
But
dramatically,
yeah,
say in the last century, humanity basically set aside nuclear energy and said no to a substantial extent, right? And
yes,
that's a similar sort of fear of where it could go. It would
yes.
have gone to, I mean, we would probably be using 10 times as much energy per capita now.
Mm.
Had we allowed nuclear energy to go full force, we would have had a few nuclear
Yeah.
accidents along the way too. But in
Mm.
some sense, we also just would be living in a stranger world. And in some sense, people saying no was resisting that change. And similarly, in the last
Yes,
few decades, we rejected genetic engineering.
yes,
And
yes.
many people thought China would be the exception. They don't think like us, but no, they
Mm.
rejected it as well.
Yep, yep.
And so there's the
Yeah,
question
those are the
is
two.
AI a
Yeah,
similar
I would
path like
say
this?
there are three big examples of things that we rejected. You mentioned two of them. The third would be psychedelics of all sorts, right? Or
Okay.
rather they were used, but they were driven underground, right? So
Right. And all
yeah.
and AI is plausibly then another example we're being asked to consider. So I don't think it's crazy that people may not, look where this seems to be going and say no, because they've done
Right.
that in other cases in the past.
Right, that's right. So yeah, it's I mean when people say that, well, a pause of AI development will never happen, I'm not so sure of that either, right? I mean,
Right.
there's already, I mean, just in the last few months, we've seen how far the Overton window has shifted, right?
Right. And now for some of these things we
Yeah.
forgo, the regulatory infrastructure required to enforce it is modest
Mm.
and not that big an extension on others. But for AI, it might be more substantial. And
Yes. I mean, the obvious thing you could do is you could, track and throttle the sale of the GPUs,
right.
right? But
But but in a fundamental sense, in order to continue to say no to more technologies, we will have
Mhm.
to continue to sort of build up a governance and enforcement structure in the world that enforces all these no's.
Yes. No, I did make this point in a blog post, not long ago, that when
Yeah,
in the 1970s, some of the most thoughtful people in the world, thought that, okay, that it's clear that nuclear energy is an existential risk to humanity, and the most important thing we could do for the human race, is to stop it. And they believe that as firmly as the AI doomers believe their position, right? And
right.
they largely did manage to stop it. And I would say that is, in retrospect, it is clear that has endangered the human race,
Well,
far
it's
more
it's
than
going farther now. People are basically trying to say no to fossil fuels now,
right, right.
right? And
Right,
that's going to
right,
be a
and
much larger cost to pay.
of course, if they hadn't said no to nuclear, that would have been a hell of a lot easier, right? I mean,
Right, of course.
that's
But now they're going to say no to both nuclear and fossil fuels.
that's the tragedy of where we are now. No, and and solar has amazingly improved, but it takes up a lot of land, and and it's
Right,
intermittent. Anyway,
right, exactly.
but now the Yudkowskians, of course, would say that well, actually nuclear weapons were were a relatively trivial danger compared to AI, right? They were
Well,
never in that much danger of literally wiping out humanity, right? They are just dumb things that we can
but I don't think that's quite fair in the sense
yeah,
that you
yeah,
should ask where would society have gone with nuclear energy? How much more would we have changed? Because that's
yeah.
the FUM fear, is
Mm,
not that they are powerful, but because of just change,
mhm,
they end up having different values. So what if our descendants, because they use more energy, have different values?
mhm. Yeah.
That is,
Yeah,
they would maybe respect nature less, right?
okay. I think there's uh, uh, um, um, would have imagined. I think that there's a lot of agreement between me and you and in our like iconoclasm, right? But the thing that we're iconoclast from is like the certain doom scenario, right? But so let's be clear that I think that they would reject this framing, right? They would say that they are totally fine with change, with evolution to a different value system, and the concern is this extremely specific thing that the AI goes FOOM, and it has it has no values that we could plausibly find.
Okay, but when you say no
Anything
values, the literal process is random drift in a random walk in a value space. That's the process by which they end up with no values. But that's the process that's already happening at a slower pace, even without FOOM. They're just imagining a way in which it happens much faster. And then by some people's argument, goes into a larger space because AI would wander farther than
Right.
humans. I don't know. I
Right.
don't buy
No,
that part.
I do want to be cautious of like the comparing radically different timescales, right? I mean, if someone says, well, anthropogenic climate change, can't be that big of a deal because, if you go back, 100 million years to the, era of the dinosaurs, there was much more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than there is now. And, the dinosaurs seem to be fine with it, right? Well, okay, but of course, also much of where our current civilization is was underwater then. For not coincidentally, right? And so I think the point is, like, everyone knows that yes, we could deal with climate change that was at a certain rate. If it was at 1% of the rate that it's at now, it would be fine, but it isn't, right? It is a question of, is the change too rapid for us to sort of
Right.
adjust?
Although, if we just imagine change happening at the same rate we saw it over the last century, we might ask, would that be acceptable if AIs evolved and technology evolved at the similar rate that we've seen, say, computers evolve for 70 years? Because in some sense, FOOM is postulating a much more even faster rate of evolution than we've actually seen in the last 70 years. But let's imagine that the economy grows at roughly the same rate for a while, and just AI grows as the same rate that computer stuff has for 70 years, would that be okay?
Mhm. Yeah, I guess I have difficulty with how do we even measure these rates, right? It seems like the rate is always compared to
Right.
some reference of how fast you expected it to go.
Right. Well, so for example, I might argue that if AIs are integrated into the world economy, they're offered by firms selling them to customers, then those firms will be continually monitoring and testing them to ensure that their values are roughly aligned with the investors and customers want. And it's only when AIs would say become a substantial part of the economy or even dominate the economy that then their values would start to drift in the direction that they choose, as opposed to being anchored by what humans at the time want. And
Yeah.
so then the question is, well, once AIs dominate the economy, is it okay for them to decide the new values? Is that a problem?
Right. I mean, to me, like that scenario seems more plausible than the Foom one. And some people might say that it is more terrifying because it's more plausible, right?
Right. Well, but now we're
It
getting
is
back to
not
the
going to be,
partiality, right?
it's not going to be the sudden alien invasion, right? It will be. I mean, like if you look at Facebook, right? It plausibly has changed the way that many people spend their lives, or or Instagram or TikTok, and very famously, not obviously for the better, right? And and it did this in some sense with the people's willing participation and consent. Right, but it took them to a place that they, that if we could vote, as you said, if we could have voted on it at the dawn of the age of social media, then plausibly we would not have voted for this, right? So
So this highlights the issue of it's just about change and whether we like the kinds and rate of change we're in now.
yes,
And in that sense, this Foom scenario is a bit of a distraction. We could be arguing about how plausible it is, but a much more likely scenario is that there will be substantial change.
It seems somehow not granular enough to just say that's all just a matter of change, right? And you could say, the asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs, right? They shouldn't be concerned. It's just, this is change. This is the kind of thing that happens.
Well, so that's why I was trying to make it less granular. That is, I was trying to go it down by looking at different dimensions of partiality. That's how I want to make it more precise. I want to say, well, what people seem to think is many other dimensions of change are okay because they're the sort that we feel intuitively used to. And this is an us-them dimension where it's a really big, important us-them dimension. And so if they come to nominate, that's just bad. But if us do, it's not so bad.
Right.
And I feel like that's a core part of this objection. It's
right. And what's interesting is that the line between us and them can sometimes depend on just, is there a line of continuity that we can see or not? Right. I mean, if I try to think about my 2-year-old self, right, I really don't have that much in common with him, right, in terms of interests, values. I mean, I guess maybe he was already interested in counting and numbers and and math a little bit, but he had no idea what was quantum computing. Most of my current values had no conception of. Right. The only reason that I sort of identify with him is, well, I can identify with my 30-year-old self, who can identify with my 20-year-old self, and so on in a progression that goes all the way back to the 2-year-old.
But AI change will be continuous.
Well, I mean, let's sort of pinpoint this, right? This is the question. I mean,
well, so certainly it'll change. It would change. AIs will change relatively continuously across time. That is, each new version that's issued won't be that different from the old one. They will be, made by companies upgrading previous products, making modifications that are, recognizable versions of previous ones.
Right. No, I mean,
that dimension they'll be continuous.
Right. No, I mean, I think the reason people are so concerned specifically about the AI self-improvement scenario is that seems to introduce a discontinuity. Right.
And then the question is, what
if you
exactly
believe in that, if you
is the
believe that.
discontinuity? So,
Yeah.
so it seems to me the
Well,
discontinuity is really in people's minds that there's like a line around the human space in minds, and then crossing that line goes into the other space of minds. That they
no, no,
have.
no, no. That's not what I'm. I'm saying like once you get a recursively self-improving AI, then like extremely rapidly, before we would even be able to react to it, you just take these enormously greater number of steps. Look,
Right.
I mean, Robin, we agree that a quantitative change, once it's become large enough, can be a qualitative one, right?
Right, but I thought if we set aside the FOOM scenario and just talk about what happens if AI grows at the rate the economy has grown in the last century, people still have concerns about that, you see.
Yes, yes.
Even though that's continuous.
I mean, absolutely. Yes.
Right. So in my mind, what people think is, yes, the machines will continually improve, but they will be discretely different from us humans. That's how people are thinking of the discreteness. They're saying this other discrete category is continuously improving.
Yes.
And it's growing faster than our other discrete category. And that's bad because it is other. The category is other.
Yes. Yeah, no, and it's interesting. I think that this might be one of the main things, that people are not predicting quite right. I mean, like, okay, if you look at how did computers figure into, the science fiction of the 50s and 60s, right? It's like, of course, there are these, they fill a room, people didn't imagine the amount of miniaturization that there would be, right? But basically there are these oracles that, issue these oracular decisions or commands, right? And the whole idea that computers would just, be things that we carry around in our pocket, that we sort of interact with as these via these very friendly interfaces, and that like the ways in which they would be scary would be, sort of ways in which we were very complicit. They would sort of social media would prey on the worst parts of human nature, and would sort of draw us in, and 5-year-olds, as I can attest from experience, would be glued to their iPad screens all the time, and not want to go outside or do things in the real world, right? But it's not that they would be attacking humans, it's that they would be seducing us, basically. And I think that with AI, there is there is a lot of potential for a similar kind of thing, but there's also a lot of potential for sort of humans and AIs being integrated together in tight feedback loops, right? So I mean, you could imagine, instead of GPT, right, imagine just sort of a GPT where you are making the decisions, right? It's giving you suggestions, right? But then you're picking which one you want, and sort of over and over, and people would just learn to write that way, right? That's the way they would write, and they could, in that way, they could produce better things than either they alone or GPT alone could produce. Right.
I think if people didn't think about the longer term future, they just had a steady stream of incremental variation products like you're describing, they would in fact come to use them and come to like them and even respect them. And then later on, they might not mind so much those things having more power and influence because they were part of their world. So I think part of the effect here is the recent language models let people imagine something very different in the future that isn't here yet. And it's that moment where you can sort of envision something very different. That is the moment when people would say no. Probably similar. If we had just slowly increased nuclear power without talking about it, people might have not have wanted to say no to nuclear power even, right? It was envisioning where it could go that made people scared. Same with genetic engineering.
Well, no, I mean, historically with nuclear power, it was these sort of very dramatic things that went wrong, as or at least that were were able to be presented as dramatic to the world, especially 3 Mile Island and then Chernobyl, right? And
but it was that people imagined much bigger versions of those things presented in people's minds,
happened, and then linked up with the, people's imaginations of the much worse things that could have happened. And that's why, even though Chernobyl maybe, killed, a few dozen people and possibly, increase the ambient cancer, we don't know. And for that reason, we don't use nuclear power, and we instead use, coal mining and other things that kill millions of people, right?
Right.
And just because it's not, it doesn't link up as much with our sort of pre-existing narratives
Right.
of disaster, right? So yeah,
So-
so so this is useful, right? Because this helps us to envision how things could go with AI, right? That people have all of these scenarios of takeover, and then there could be a bad thing that happens with AI in the future, but which is a much smaller scale bad thing than the Yudkowskian scenario. But because of it, people will say, all right, this has to be stopped entirely, right? Because this is now this is the very thing that we've been warning about, or whatever.
I'd like to hear your reaction to a point about partiality, which is that we can see through theory how some kinds of partiality can be selected for through genetic and cultural evolution, and others cannot and are not. And it seems to me that the AI one is actually one of the kinds that is not so much selected by natural selection of genes or memes. So for example, think of generations. You can be partial toward your generation, but it's not plausible that genetics, you'll be selecting for your genes or memes on the basis of that sort of partiality. That is, that sort of partiality won't be selected for on the basis of selecting your genes or memes. And similarly, like at least in biological evolution, being partial toward your gender doesn't really help your long-term evolution, because there's this strong equilibrium where you have to have 50-50 mix of the genders, right?
And yet people do have all of these partialities, right?
They do, but the question is whether you should retain them.
People use birth control,
Right.
and people do many things that make no sense from an evolutionary standpoint.
Sure, but so the argument is, you notice that you have many partialities, but now you might ask, which do you want to keep? Which do you want to resist, or which do you want to embrace? And it might be that noticing sort of the evolutionary forces that produce them might influence whether you want to keep them or reject them. And so I might say, partialities that have no function, say, or are dysfunctional, you might want to reject. Whereas partialities that you see the point of, that you see they have advantages, you might want to retain. So you might think being partial toward your family, that not only is selected for by evolution, but you see many functional advantages of being partial to your family. That helps that you pay attention to your family rather than random people in the world. Okay. But then we might say this partiality toward humans versus artificial machines, that actually can't really being selected for by genetic or mimetic evolution, and it's not terribly functional. So maybe you don't want to embrace it so strong. Let me give you another analogy.
I don't know. I mean, if you're asking me like what partialities I should have, then now you're asking me a question that sort of cannot be answered by reference to evolution, right? It can only be answered by reference to moral philosophy and reasoning, I would say.
Well, but this is a kind of reason you could introduce a moral philosophy. Let me give you an example of the pro-Earth partiality. So we could say, there's humans on Earth and there's space humans who are not on Earth. We're Earth humans. We should be partial toward Earth humans. You know how we could be partial toward Earth humans? Preventing anybody from leaving. Then they'll only be Earth humans, and we will succeed at promoting Earth humans over space humans, right? And that's a partiality that couldn't really be selected for by genetic or biological evolution or mimetic evolution. And it also is just pretty dysfunctional, right? We cut off this big space of possibilities just because we're going to be partial toward Earth.
I mean, maybe we need to drill down on this concept of partiality, right? It's like there's the kind of partiality where you think, your group is inherently better than other groups. Your group should dominate. Your group should either, rule or displace the other groups, right? And then there's the much more limited kind of partiality where you say, okay, I would like my group to continue to exist. It can
Yeah.
coexist with the other groups, but it shouldn't be wiped out, right? And I think that you'll get many people, also many more moral philosophers, on board with the latter kind of partiality, right? And and part of the fear of, certainly the Kauskian fear, of AI is that it literally just wipes us all out, right? And I think that, okay, I can, if you really believe that that was going to happen, then I of course I understand, being partial to sort of you and your progeny not being wiped out. But
So long ago, I had a post called "Prefer Law to Values," where I
Hmm.
said, like, people get obsessed with, do they share our values, as a proxy for will they wipe us out?
Hmm.
And I say, well, actually, if you're thinking of moving to a foreign country, you would ask not, do the people living there share my values so much? You'd ask, do they have, a stable legal system and protect property and that sort of thing?
Well,
Because you want a world where they protect your values.
that's the question that some people would ask. Other people really would ask, do they share my values, right? Or at least do they have a value system that can coexist with my value system, let's say.
Right, but the coexistence is more about, can you have a social environment wherein you respect each other's property and actions and things like that? And that's what, law is, right?
Hmm.
It's the focus on the
Well,
aspect
okay,
of
but I think the question people would be asking when they're looking to move is not fully encompassed by law, right? They're looking also at culture, right? Are these people, do these people have a culture that is sort of that is sufficiently compatible with my culture that I could enjoy being there?
But if you were worried about your family being exterminated in this
Yes,
country,
yes.
that's less about the culture and more about the law.
Yeah, right. Although the two things, right, like if you were, a Jewish person, deciding whether you should move from the US back to Europe in the 1930s, right? The law, maybe the laws right now, say,
Right.
are okay in the country you're considering, but you would certainly want to also look at the culture. Right. I mean,
Right.
right, because because law and culture co-evolve.
But certainly relative to the focus of
Yeah.
most people are overwhelmingly focused on, when they talk about alignment, they talk about, does it share our values?
Yes.
And that seems to be,
Yeah.
overemphasized relative to, do they
Hmm.
respect a larger social system, system of law, property, governance, etc.
Okay. This, and we've been talking for an hour. This might be the clearest disagreement that we found in
Okay.
an hour, right? I feel like the values are maybe the fundamental thing, right? And basically, if someone has enough alignment with your values, then you trust that whatever laws they come up with will probably be laws that you're more or less okay with. And if they don't, if their values are fundamentally alien to yours and they're powerful enough, then you're very worried that no law is going to protect you.
Well, let's take the example
Yeah.
of the super intelligences in our world, the large organizations like firms and government agencies, and ask, are we afraid of them? What keeps them in line, aligned with us?
Mm-hmm.
And one postulate might be, they share our values. And another postulate might be, they, competition and law force them to serve us, not because they share our values, but because this larger structure makes them serve us.
I think it's really crucial here that these are mental constructs that are made of us. That is sort of
But I don't think that's
you
true.
can for some purposes you can think of a corporation as this autonomous entity pursuing its interests, or so forth, but it has an actual CEO, right? It has a board of directors. It has
Okay.
people who
So
can make a decision to,
let me push on this point.
and most importantly, who can be blamed as individuals if this giant entity does something that is bad.
I would claim that if a corporation figured out a thing it could do that would be profitable,
Mhm,
and that it could get away with it in terms of
mhm,
law and governance and customers,
mhm,
that they could typically find employees willing to do whatever it was they
mhm,
needed to do. That is,
mhm,
there's the willingness of employees to do certain things is not that much of a constraint on corporations pursuing their profits,
mhm.
including CEOs. If they needed a certain side of CEO who is willing to take certain actions, they could find such a CEO.
Mhm.
That would be my claim, and therefore it's not
Yeah,
about I mean, you're saying it's because
yeah.
they only have humans who can sit in these roles,
Well,
that's why they
no,
behave. I
no.
don't think that's true.
Certainly there is no principle that prevents corporations from doing horrible things. That would be absurd to deny, right? Everyone
Right.
can see with their own eyes that happens. But I think that in practice, when that happens, people who are responsible for those decisions, or at whom the buck stopped or was supposed to stop, right? And I think that people are not wrong to put the blame on those individuals.
Right. But I'm saying it's
Yeah.
not because they're human in that role. You
Mm.
can hold them accountable because they can be held accountable. That's law,
Yeah.
not their human
Right.
nature. Right.
Right.
So if AIs were sitting in
Yeah.
that slot and they could be held
Mhm.
accountable, they would similarly have to behave because they could be held accountable. It's about the law holding people accountable, not about human nature or values.
I see. No, this is a very interesting question, though. How will the law hold AIs accountable, right? I mean, and will it be able to? I mean, it's a major question. And by the way, when people talk about like what job displacement is AI going to cause, to like white collar workers, including in the relatively near future, right? It seems to me that one of the major breaks on this is just that we do not yet know how to hold AIs accountable when things go wrong.
I mean, I think
And
we know many ways
like
to
a
do it.
lot
We
of a
haven't
lot of jobs
chosen.
mostly exist in order for there to be someone to blame if things don't happen correctly.
I think we know
And
many ways to do it. We haven't chosen which ones, but
hmm,
I would say law has plenty of tools available to deal with this sort of situation. It's not a thing
well,
that law
okay.
can't deal with. It's just we have to decide which ones.
Yeah, well, okay, but I mean, you're right. I mean, there are many legal questions here that have yet to be tested, right?
Right. But that doesn't mean that
Yeah.
law is incapable of handling this problem just because there are many choices. Like if you said,
Well,
I need a car to get to work, and I
mhm.
said, you haven't figured out which car you want. You don't know if it's red or
Yeah, no,
blue or
all right,
sports
look,
car. I'm saying, yes, but cars exist. Cars can get you to work.
I do understand the principle, right? But um, I think that in practice, people will be very unhappy with a corporation-like entity that can do something evil, and then all of the people who are involved can claim that it wasn't their fault because they were just following the AI's directive, and
I mean, I'd go farther and
whoever
say,
created the AI can claim that it wasn't their fault either because they didn't do the fine tuning or whatever, right? I mean, I think that uh, um, um, uh, yeah, for us to be able to sort of shift our categories of blame to blaming artificial entities, I think that would be a major leap, and it is hard to understand how it happens by degrees, right?
so honestly,
Maybe you could sketch for me, like, how does
the,
that happen by degrees?
in the world today, the
Yeah,
ability to sue CEOs is a
yeah.
relatively minor effect on how we keep corporations in charge, right?
Mm.
Much more is the ability to sue the company
Yeah.
and hold it liable.
Right. Well, just because the company has so much more assets.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so that would similarly hold for AIs. That is, you could sue
Mm.
the company as well. And my main point is you trust large organizations in our world today, not because the people working for them share your values. That's not why you could
Let's say
trust them.
to whatever extent I do trust them. I mean, let's not
Right,
make
exactly.
too many
But I
assumptions
think you
here.
do, in
Yeah.
fact, trust them to a
Mm.
substantial extent. That is, you're not worried about corporations exterminating humans or,
Mhm.
doing terrible things. The extent you're not so
Mhm.
worried about them, it's
Mhm.
because of law and competition, not they're sharing your values.
I mean, I would put it differently. I mean, just circling back to the beginning of the conversation, and maybe this is a good place to wrap up, right? I would say that large organizations, whatever, universities, foundations, corporations, governments, they are in a tight feedback loop with the humans who comprise them, right? And so, it's something like we can think of them as doing some things autonomously, right? But they are not sort of veering
Right.
off, totally, like an autonomous vehicle with
Right.
no human anywhere near the controls, right? There
So
are
we
humans at
agree.
the controls, and
Right. So
they
I
are
think we agree
adjusting.
then
Yeah.
that in the near future, if AIs stay in a tight feedback loop with the human customers and builders, then that looks like a pretty reasonable future. The fear is of a FOOM scenario where suddenly they split off,
Yeah.
or more
Yeah.
plausibly, I think we might agree that just AIs eventually become a large fraction of the economy, and then they start to dominate where everything goes. And then we could talk about how much we're worried about that, but that's a separate
Yeah.
scenario to be worried about.
Yeah, no, Boaz Barak and I had this blog post recently where we tried to sketch out like 5 possible futures of AI, one of which is that it fizzles, it just doesn't get much more, qualitatively better than it is right now, which, it almost seems like a ridiculously contrarian scenario, right? But I think it's
Right. Yeah.
possible, maybe
Sure.
we've
In
just
the short
run
term.
out of training data and that's the bottleneck, right?
Right.
But then, there's sort of the singularity scenario, which could be either good or bad. Like it could be either the utopia or the sort of paper clip-ellipse. But then there's like the scenario where as we put it, civilization recognizably continues. And I think that's pretty coextensive with sort of we co-evolve with the AIs. Right, where systems evolve that involve both humans and AIs in tight feedback loops, right? And that again could be either good or bad, right? We call the scenarios, Futurama or AI dystopia. But I mean, I think that as long as we're in that kind of scenario, then I am, I am less than maximally pessimistic. Right.
Right. We were noticing that.
I think that could be a good world, or at least something that our descendants will consider to be a good world, even if we would find it to be an extremely strange world. Or it would just like Plato, maybe it would take us a decade to get used to it.
And as we discussed, if ordinary people could see that world and vote on it, they may well vote against it. And that's an issue we're all facing.
Yeah, right. No, I think that there are still, even if we assume that that's the world that we're heading to, we should worry about lots of safety issues and, push things more toward the future, toward the sort of, pleasant Futurama end than toward the dystopian end, and at the same time, I think that we should pay attention to the possibility of a FOOM, right? And even if it's only a few percent probability, we judge, right, that is more than enough to devote resources to worrying about it. So but I do, and I think that we agree about sort of seeing a variety of possible scenarios here, and not, and one thing we have in common is that our thinking is not just completely dominated by the FOOM scenario, that it doesn't just sort of loom over everything that we're thinking about.
And to plant a flag, I did offer a FOOM liability proposal that if it's a problem, would be so more robust to dealing with that problem. Even if I think it's less likely, I'm fine with offering robust policies that can deal with problems, even if I'm not so worried about them.
Which I say is one of the most Hansonian ideas ever.
All right.
All right.
So I guess we should wrap up. And it's been nice talking to you, Scott.
Yeah, it was great talking to you as always, Robin. All right.
All right.
Take care.
Bye.
Okay, bye.